Hello, I just want to let you know that we're going to start in about 5 minutes, so a few more minutes. Thank you.
Are you speaking from the podium?
No, speaking.
Yeah.
Karen. So Aaron. Good afternoon. Hello. I'm Kyle Pope. I'm the editor and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review. Thank you very much for coming. When we decided to put this together and hold this on the eve of the midterms, we were concerned that maybe it would be sort of off point, that people would be focused on election issues and not so much on what this issue is about, which is race. And of course, that's not true. This race is squarely about, this election is squarely about race, front and center. It just gives us a ton to talk about. Trump's election is also the sort of news peg behind our decision to focus this issue of the Columbia Journalism Review on race. This is the first time we've devoted the entire issue to looking at race and the coverage of race. It's the first time in the 61-year history of CJR that we've done that, and we're all very proud of what's resulted. What we've found is that while Trump was the sort of animated the discussion around race and media, both for good and ill, he didn't really do much to change the larger through line, which is that people of color make up about 17% of newsroom staffs, even though 37% of the population is not white. That's the number for newspapers. The number for online and TV is a little bit better. The number for radio is a little bit worse. But the trend lines are there, and they've been there for about the last 20 years. This gap has existed. So that was really the starting point for this issue, trying to figure out why that is, what it means, going back to the release of the Kerner Commission report 50 years ago up to today, and trying to figure out why so much has been left unchanged. We were incredibly lucky and honored to have Jelani Cobb join us as a guest editor of this issue. You'll hear, he's right back there, you'll hear more from Jelani in a conversation with Lydia Polgreen later. And he really helped us frame how to think about this and how to sort of turn this frustration and these issues into stories and art and photographs that we think are really compelling. Before we go any further, I want to thank a few people. I want to thank the Ford Foundation, which helped support this issue as well as CJR's ongoing coverage of race. I want to thank The Guardian, which is live streaming this conversation. And I want to thank my colleagues at CJR who have been tireless in making this happen. We're going to have time for questions, so please keep those in mind. And to keep things moving, please keep your question in the form of a question. So if you could just go up to that mic and let us know who you are and what you want to know, that would be helpful. So I think clearly the place to start is on the midterms, which is what's on all of our minds. And I don't think we could have assembled a group of people who have put more thought into the coverage of race and politics than the people who are sitting here with me. Adam Serwer is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Aaron Haynes-Wack is the national race reporter for the Associated Press. Karen Ho is a former colleague of mine at CJR who now is a freelance writer based in Toronto. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
So Adam, I'm going to start with you because I was really taken with a piece that you wrote in The Atlantic recently, the title of which was "The Cruelty is the Point." If you haven't read it, you should. It sort of frames this moment that we're in, both in terms of these elections and the Trump presidency, as a referendum on hate and fear in the country, especially toward people of color. And I thought it was to me one of the more memorable pieces that have come out of this cycle. When you look at the coverage of this race, Adam, do you think it sort of conveys the sort of urgency of the moment that we're in? How do you assess the coverage of the midterms as it relates to what's being said and done around race?
I mean, I think the coverage definitely reflects that. I think in some cases, I think journalism in general has a kind of historical amnesia problem. So, you know, I think the Washington Post had a piece the other day that was sort of framing this election on a referendum on whether Trump is a historical anomaly or is like a part of American everyday life. And the answer is we have the answers to both of those questions. We know it's not an anomaly historically because we can go there and look. The information is there for us to find. And we know it's a part of everyday life because we're living it. But I think there's a temptation to present Trump as sui generis, as a manifestation of something un-American, when in fact he is a manifestation of forces that have shaped American politics, forever, since America has existed. And I think I spend a lot of time, and I have spent a lot of time in the past couple of years, really, I think that is the overarching theme of my reporting and my writing and my work, is to just excavate the forces that are guiding our politics today as something that have always guided our politics, and that we have, in a way, chosen to forget because it's not congruent with what we generally think of as what America is. And I say we, I mean, the general sort of American historical consensus of America as a place where, anybody can be an American, give us you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, all that. These are assumptions that I think belie what has actually occurred in our history.
And do you think that story is being conveyed? I
think there are a lot of writers who are trying to convey it. I think that it's not really present to me when I read coverage of Trump, and in a way that's hard. It's very hard for people who cover Trump day to day to suddenly give you all this historical context. But I think that the biggest problem I would say that I see with the way that the press covers Trump is that is not so much that it doesn't convey the urgency or the stakes, although sometimes it doesn't do that for reasons that I'll get into in a second. I think that it is easily misled into Trump's efforts to scare the crap out of white people. And that's because it's not just an effective political strategy, it's an effective readers and ratings strategy. I think something like I forget, I think it was Vanity Fair, but there was a piece about CNN and how it's just, they keep talking about Trump because it gets people watch CNN when they talk about Trump. So you have a sort of financial incentive for the press to amplify the president's racist fear-mongering, and I'm not sure how you deal with that problem. I think it's a genuine problem for journalism. How do you deal with propaganda that is designed to mislead people when it's coming from someone who you absolutely have to cover what they say? And I don't think we've really figured that out yet.
Yeah, you had this amazing fact today where all of the finally, after NBC acquiesced, all of the major broadcast outlets are refusing to run a campaign ad from the President of the United States because they think it's racist, which on the one hand is good, I guess, but it's also extraordinary.
Yeah, but NBC aired it in prime time during a football game. And and NBC's corporate ties to the president are already really iffy and questionable, given his association with The Apprentice and all that stuff. I mean, it doesn't look good in my opinion.
No, I agree. And they only refused to run it after they got a significant amount of heat. Aaron, what do you? I assume that you agree with what he said about the sort of focus. What do you think?
Pretty much.
What do you think are the sort of stories about race that are sort of embarrassingly undercovered in this cycle, as it relates to the midterms?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are probably a couple, and I think I wouldn't just say during the midterms, I would say usually on a regular basis, which is why they also got missed in the midterms. I'm thinking specifically about, coverage of Latino voters, who I don't think we paid enough attention to, of course, until, the scary caravan horde was bearing down on our border. We were not asking them, what their issues are, if they plan to vote, how they may factor into the midterm cycle, because I mean, again, this is a group who was targeted from the day that the president came down the escalator and announced that he was going to run for the office that he now has. So, 2 years later, when they have a chance to weigh in and make their voices heard, asking them if and how they plan to do that should have been something that we heard a lot more about, but I don't think that it was. And also, I think the Native American community we have ignored. I mean, we have been talking, well, a lot of the voter suppression conversation that we were having was obviously around Russia and their hacking into our election system, but we have focused more recently on voter suppression among African Americans, especially in southern states where we know that there are key contests. But Native Americans, meanwhile, have had their own struggles, unique struggles with voter suppression that we only came around to cover probably when it was too late to do something about it. I mean, I think people are trying to mitigate that at this point, but here we are kind of in the 11th hour saying, oh, wait, Native Americans are having a hard time voting, when that was probably a story that we could have been paying attention to earlier if we had sources and inroads in those communities already.
Karen, what do you think about the sort of undercovered stories?
No one knows what's going on right now in Asian America when it comes at the national level. And what are those issues that are not being asked of at the White House press corps in regards to the recovery efforts right now in the refugee community, Cambodians and Vietnamese, the communities, how is that recovery effort in the Asian American community in places like Texas and in the Florida Panhandle? Nobody really knows. Because there isn't that kind of representation and thinking and view that they are important. Even within Pew Research studies, sometimes Asian isn't a category when it comes to race. And so there's a real problem there. I think there's even growing coverage when it comes to culture, topics like real estate and integration and schools, and especially at the education level with foreign students. But I really wonder, the issue of how long do they have to live in America to become important? Like, some of the people, Asians have been living in the United States for decades. They've set up businesses, they've run for office. But even when it comes to the women who are running for Congress, there haven't been a lot of profiles about Asian Americans. And I really wonder what it takes for them to break through and sort of capture that kind of attention, to be on CNN or MSNBC and sort of have that spotlight, because it's so hard for Asian Americans to be considered even for political reporting roles.
I would also, just to add to Karen's point, I mean, the precursor to our current immigration politics was actually focused on Asian Americans. I mean, the first immigration laws that sought to exclude specific races of people from immigrating to the United States were targeted at the Chinese. So, I mean, and later the Japanese, but this idea that, Asian immigrants were going to take over our country and bring over all their evil habits and et cetera, that, almost everything that people are saying about Latino immigrants today, they once said about Asian immigrants to the United States. So just to add to Karen's point, that's a big part of that story too.
I mean, I'm having such sense of deja vu hearing all of you talk back to 2016. After the election of 2016, there was this amazing round of navel gazing by the press and by editors and by newsrooms to say, we overcovered the horse race, we overcovered polling, we missed whole communities and didn't understand what they were thinking. We need to sort of rethink how we organize ourselves so these kind of mistakes don't happen again. And basically, here we are a day before, this incredibly important midterm, and it's the same thing.
Well, yeah, because the response to that was, we need to cover the aggrieved working white class. So that was the community that was ignored and forgotten and needed to be paid attention to. And so that's where you get the tremendous focus on those folks really for the past couple of years. And also, I mean, not to mention they have also been the group that Trump has visited with his ongoing campaign rallies, since he's been in office. And so they have remained in the spotlight, both because we have kept them there, but also because the president keeps them there to the exclusion of some of the communities of color, some other disaffected groups who, frankly, have not gotten the same level of attention. I mean, we can talk about, I guess what I'm saying is that white people, and especially white men, are not the only rural voters out there. They are not the only suburban voters out there. They are not the only voters of faith out there. They are not the only educated voters out there. And yet, usually the default setting when we were referring to any of those groups is white.
I think you can see something, you can see that sort of, recently with the big story that the president was going to try to rewrite the 14th Amendment to the Constitution with an executive order. That decision would create, for the first time since the Civil War, a hereditary, stateless underclass in the United States. And there was almost no coverage of what life would be like for people like that, who were essentially stripped of any rights that they might be able to claim. Instead, there was some good legal coverage and there was some extremely bad legal coverage, but there was very little on how this would affect the communities that it was targeted to affect.
I think the other thing about the problem right prior to 2016 and then immediately afterwards was people keep thinking it's somebody else's problem. And definitions regarding who is normal America, following what Aaron said. I reread the CEO of Axios, his column right before the election of 2016, and he defines normal America as two small blue-collar towns that are more than 90% white. In one case, 97% white. That's who he sees as normal America. And that comes from who he hires. Axios is a predominantly white company, media company, who he provides resources to and who everybody else follows when he has a scoop, like the amendment regarding birthright citizenship. And that, I think there's a huge problem right now in terms of the feeling of competition. And if journalism is the first draft of history, it's still going to be written predominantly by white people and white men. And I really worry there hasn't been a radical rethinking in terms of who's covering the White House, who's covering politics, and even in terms of not following trends or perceived trends, because no one wants to be the last person that feels left out. A lot of people after 2016 could have gone other routes and really invested resources into American citizens who couldn't get passports, or the situation, like Aaron said, of Americans in rural areas that weren't white and what their issues were. And but managers in many newsrooms decided that wasn't their strategy going forward between 2016 and 2018, and that's why we have the situation that we have today.
I want to turn just in a second to how the lack of diversity in newsrooms feeds into this problem, which is fundamentally a big part of it. But before we get to that, Adam, you said something interesting on a phone call we had, which was you predicted that if the election goes for the Republicans, even if they keep what they've got, or if that a lot of the coverage is going to shift to how this was a sort of a genius tactical move. This racist ad that they ran about the caravan and the focus on the caravan. And it sort of speaks to, I think, a problem in political coverage, which is just this like tactics and strategy focus over what are these sort of core fundamental issues.
Look, the tenets of objectivity in American journalism allow you to express certain opinions. Certain opinions are okay. You're allowed to defend the troops. And you're allowed to pronounce. You're not allowed to pronounce on the morality of particular political tactics, but you are allowed to pronounce on their effectiveness. And in a way that sort of creates an incentive to be amoral or immoral, because the only thing that journalists are going to care about is whether or not it worked. And you can actually see that already. There was an NBC, there was a write-up of the NBC poll which showed the Democrats with something like a 7-point generic ballot lead, which is on the edge of what they need to take the House given gerrymandering, and it said Trump's immigration campaigning had quote unquote brought the base home. And so, you're allowed to say, oh, it worked, but you're not allowed to say, man, it's really ugly that it worked. And that sort of creates a weird incentive where, you can praise people for being brilliant when they're, doing and saying things that are not true or that are bigoted, but you can't actually say that's wrong. And I mean, again, American objectivity, like mainstream media objectivity exists for a reason, but that's, one of the problems with it. That's one of the downsides.
Yeah, which really is why it's important that you do have people like Adam, like some of our other colleagues that are willing to provide context to this moment, because, it's not enough to just say this is what happened. We should be saying this is what it means, because, that's, otherwise, why else are people reading us? They can watch the news, they can look on YouTube, they can follow, they can be on Twitter and see what happened, but they need to try to understand and synthesize what this moment is about. And so, yeah, if, you have, these, this racial rhetoric, and you have, racist robocalls, being put out, and you have, racist rhetoric on the campaign trail, and that is something that voters are okay with, we need to talk about what that means. We need to talk about what that means for our democracy. It is about more than just the horse race. It is about more than, how does this bode for 2020? Like, how does this bode for our democracy?
Just following what they said, I think it's important that the concept of neutrality and objectivity should have been really re-examined in 2016, but even more so now, and how we report these results under the guise of neutrality, because I think as journalists should say, if if the results are this is what it means for these people right away. We can see that through history. Like, we have the data, we have reporting on Steve Miller's policies, and we have the history of vulnerable communities. What did it mean when politicians won? Immediately, what happened to them? Because that is not, and a lot of times when journalism has tried to be neutral, I think looking to history has been a great example to see what public opinion has been and what has history said afterwards. Things about like interracial marriage or rights for women that we have seen afterwards. And looking at the press coverage and the perception of neutral coverage versus what history said afterwards is a great example for, I think, a lot of places to really set strategies and sort of defense mechanisms for any sort of criticism that they face if they are accused of not being neutral or objective.
I would also add that the consensus now is that race and identity are essential to the president's political identity, but that wasn't always the consensus. In 2016, when writers of color were saying that, they were often scolded by their white colleagues for unfairly tarring people as racist, or that's going too far or whatever. But now it's basically everybody agrees that it's the case whether you like Trump or not. And I think it's sort of, it's the nature of things that what was once a fringe opinion and becomes conventional wisdom, everybody forgets that they used to not agree with it. But that's, you can really see a difference in the way that this is talked about from 2016 to 2018.
Jamil Hill was punished for saying what now everybody understands to be true. Like, we have to remember that people lost, I saw a black journalist point out that everybody forgets in the rush for everybody to realize these kinds of truths. People lost their job. People were punished in newsrooms, in academia, in their workplaces for pointing out real truths about what's going on right now. And, and it's mostly journalists of color, and especially women, who really sounded the alarms. And we have to remember that those are the people who are most vulnerable when it comes to even getting into newsrooms and staying there and getting to the top levels.
And it took a while, and even now, there is, I do still feel that there is some hesitancy, among editors to actually call something racist. I mean, using the word racist
Racially
or
tinged.
using the word lie, racially charged, racially tinged. What do those mean? What does that mean? Why can't you just say this was racist or this is racism? I think. I think that calls into question like our ability to recognize what racist and racism is.
So let's talk about what newsrooms could be doing that they're not doing, and what individual journalists should be doing. Aaron, you make a point of making sure that if you quote an expert or experts in your piece, that they're people of color, which is a very simple enough thing for other people to model. Why don't they? and what else should, what is the sort of punch list for what newsrooms need to be doing right now?
Well, I mean, I think the main reason that they don't is because we tend to be on deadline sometimes and reach for the closest thing to us. If you get an email from a college with 6 names of experts that can help you out on X, Y, and Z issue right then and there, thank you. I may just start calling these people whose expertise has already been identified. I've got a direct number to them, and I know that they're going to be responsive to me on that issue. Am I thinking in that moment, gee, everybody on this list is white, or everybody on this list is a man? Probably not. I'm thinking, gee, I can get this person and I can get this story out the door. Like, I know that happens. I know that we do that. However, when you're not on deadline, that is the time to put in the little bit of work, because it's really not that hard, to be deliberate about diversifying sources. Because, yes, I am thinking, do I have enough women? Do I have enough people of color that I can go to, not just to talk about issues of race, but to speak intelligently on whatever the issue is that is intersecting with race that I'm writing about? Do I know enough black historians? Do I know enough black economists? Do I know enough black pollsters? Who do I know, in the Native community, in the Latino community, in the Asian community that can speak to me on these issues when they pop up? Because I don't want to be able to say that I can't write about something because I don't have somebody that can help me, write and report with authority on an issue, because I just don't know anybody. And there's nobody that I can ask that knows somebody. So, I mean, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be me that is going out and finding these people. Like, when I talk to somebody, if I'm interviewing somebody and I say, who else, give me a smart colleague that you have, that I could talk to about these similar issues. Who else do you know that could help me speak about this? I mean, that's really easy. You don't even have to look it up yourself, Somebody else is giving you somebody's cell number and email, for you to do that. So it is really not that hard. But it is a choice.
What else? What else do these? What else needs to happen to move to get this flatline number that I talked about at the beginning that basically hasn't shifted much in 20 years? What else needs to happen to move the needle?
So shame isn't working. Shame is not working because that photo of Axios and their staff, everyone in the journalists of color community was astonished. It was like trying to find Waldo for all the journalists of color in that photo. But telling them that is reflected in their coverage and it's hurting everyone else who's not in that photo is not enough anymore. What we really need to do is build it into standards and practices. We need to put it in performance reviews that if you are only interviewing middle-aged white men or only men, or you are on a panel, like Bloomberg has put it that they cannot participate in panels that are only men. That their staff have to do their part to say, I can recommend a colleague instead to be part of this panel. In performance reviews, they're often noted if you got somebody arrested or, what kind of impact did your story have. It should be noted if you helped a colleague translate, because you had the language ability, that you connected them to a source, that you consistently demonstrated that you were reaching out to members of the community and interviewing people who had never been interviewed before. Those people should be rewarded financially and professionally on a consistent basis. And then also at a manager level, if you're consistently only promoting men or white staff, that should be punished. That needs to be punished. People need to be given funding to go to journalism organizations like NABJ and NAHJ and not just recruit people for interviews, but how often are they hiring people from those interviews? Because if you're only bringing in a Latino or a black journalist so that your interview pool looks good, but you're actually only hiring white men, then that should be punished. That needs to be punished. Otherwise, we're never going to move these numbers at the ASNI level consistently. And then also, I think it's remembering that if you're going to bring in somebody different, it's going to be awkward on purpose, because that often is punished in meetings. And I think it's for culture fit, it's always going to be a really awkward thing. And then there's so much. I mean, publicly, BuzzFeed just laid off everyone in their podcast division, and it was mostly minorities. And they just said, oh, it was good for our business to do that. And I don't know how to, whether it be managerial peers of Jonah Peretti saying, how could you do that? Like you're hurting everyone else. We recruit, or like the people that you helped bring in that expertise is going to hurt everybody else who wants to do podcasting as well. I think it also helped, white male allies really have to do a lot of work too, and they can't, everybody has to stop thinking it's somebody else's job to fix this problem. It's everyone's job to fix this problem. And if newsrooms are waiting for someone else and thinking that this is someone else's problem, while also wondering about the trust issue and how they're going to increase subscription numbers, then they're not realizing that these are two sides of the same coin.
I would say that I think a really important aspect of this is getting people of color in managerial and editorial and editor positions, not simply as writers and reporters. I also think that it's a mistake to frame diversifying a publication as a favor. It's actually a matter of self-interest. You're not doing something for someone else. You're strengthening your publication's ability to cover the news better. And I think organizations that have looked at it in that way have done better than organizations who have simply been trying to check a box, and that's not what anybody is actually looking for.
Yeah, and it is a coverage issue. I mean, going into 2020, you are looking at possible multiple candidates of color, being, running for president. Like, do you really want to be in the same position that you were in 2008 with no reporters of color covering the person that ends up becoming the first black president of this country? Like, no, you don't want to be that. Do you want to be the newsroom that misses the story about black women dominating the most active midterm cycle that we've had in my lifetime? No, you don't want to be that newsroom. So at this point, it really is it's a competitive advantage for you to have journalists of color, and to both Adam and Karen's point, gatekeepers and people who are in a position to hire, who are going to be thinking about this. And yes, definitely attaching that to, like you said, not just the performance reviews, but to bonuses, to money. Like not only can your outlet make money, but like make it personal. Like you personally can make money if you do a better job of this. I think that is something that everybody hears.
Just to piggyback off of Erin's point, I mean, the story that I remember, an example of this, of a story that I remember from 2008, was there was like a weird story that was sort of framed as a kind of scandal, where they found out that Barack Obama had ancestors who owned slaves on his father's side, and this was like a big, this was sort of a scandalous thing. I was like, do you know any African Americans? I mean, like, like this is not actually unusual for Black Americans to be partially descended from slave owners. It's actually pretty common. So I mean, it's just one of those things. Like it absolutely, you don't know what you don't know, and if you don't have someone there who knows what you don't know, you're never going to find out.
Not to take away from what he might say, but Jelani has a piece that the opening piece of the magazine went up online today, and there's he mentions David Carr, who hired him, and Ta-Nehisi Coates and some other people. Did you hire? You didn't hire, no. At the Washington City paper, and just to the point you just made, and Carr's view wasn't so. I mean, his view wasn't that he was trying to score points by hiring people of color. He just knew that there were stories that he wasn't getting, and he's like, the only reason I'm hiring you is because you give me stories I don't have, and that's sort of to your point. I mean, like, how do we sort of create a newsroom of people that are going to reflect the stories that we're interested in, what's going on in the country? Did I summarize that right, Jelani? Karen, you're in an interesting going to the sort of hiring question, because you were at the J School, and then you were at CJR for a year, and you're sort of in the workforce, and you're talking to these people that we're talking about who are like looking to staff up their newsrooms, and I know that it's been frustrating. What have you learned about how they sort of view these issues?
Managers still don't know how to factor in layoffs, and young people's experience. Young people are the first often to be laid off in newsrooms, especially at digital shops. We're still discussing the catastrophe that happened with the pivots to video. And if a newsroom is still relying on how much time someone has had in a newsroom, regardless of size, it doesn't factor into the current economy regarding freelancing and layoffs. And the business situation at many newsrooms, where people can be fired within weeks of being hired at even shops like Gothamist. When Gothamist folded, I had interviewed people there who had only been there for 3 months. And so, and they were journalists of color. And so then to go to a prestige newsroom that said, you're really interesting, you have lots of different skills, you even have Ivy League degrees or a unique experience and all the typical things, but you don't have as much time on the clock as a white guy who's been in a newsroom for 5 or 10 years. That is a circumstance completely out of my control in terms of where I was born and the circumstance that I was laid off from my first job. And I really want managers to think about who they're cutting out as a result of this hiring strategy, and what they're losing as a result of this narrow focus on years on the clock. And I think it's also really interesting in terms of we see this in programs like MetPro at the LA Times. There's a real disconnect between the advantages of those journalists of color that they're hiring through that program and the mood that they have in the long term by being paid significantly less than their white peers through traditional hiring channels. And I think that's a problem that's not just in the United States. We're seeing it in Canada with journalists of color actually quitting the national newspaper as a result of this kind of feeling, even when they get in the door. I think it's also problematic, as Adam said, when you don't see people who look like you at the senior management levels, because you don't feel like there's a ladder or a path for you to institute real change at a wider level and create an inclusive, forward-thinking organization. If the people at the top who are always being promoted look a certain way. And then finally, I think it's about the stories that are being prioritized. Even when you hire the right people and they're suggesting story ideas and they're being told to cover something else, that is also a real problem, because you're not. The whole point of hiring them was for their different ideas or their perspective, and tampering it from the get-go. There are only so many fights every journalist of color has, and it's like a battery. And eventually people get tired and quit, or to other newsrooms that seem more inclusive, or they quit journalism altogether. And we see that in these long-term retention levels all the time.
So this is a good day to talk about predictions. What do you think is going to happen tomorrow?
I have no idea, and I don't think anybody else does.
That wasn't actually my question, but I think you're right. Do you think that we're going to be having the same exact conversation in 2 years about the median race?
Yes, because the financial incentives are not going to change that much in 2 years. I mean, the reality is that premium news is mostly done for a middle to upper middle class white audience, and it is going to reflect their interests, preferences, and worldview. And I think that, structurally, I'm not sure that there's a way around that beyond news organizations deciding that they're going to do things a different way. But the financial incentives are so strong that I don't think it's something that changes in 2 years.
I think that we could be, but I also think that that would be a shame, because I think that what we should have learned by now, 2 years after the 2016 election and 10 years after the election of the first black president, is that the intersection of race and politics is not going anywhere anytime soon. So, it makes sense to probably go ahead and ramp up. I mean, I think we're getting ready to get the most diverse Congress we've had in a while. Shouldn't that also be reflected in our press corps, in our political journalism ranks? It stands to reason that should be happening. But, with all the additional candidates of color that you had running in this election cycle, you didn't have a rush of hiring among political journalists of color, which I think was a missed opportunity. There's time to do that before 2020. I mean, you've got newsrooms right now on a hiring spree looking for political journalists to cover 2020. If candidates of color are not in the mix for that talent grab, I think that would be a loss. And I think that you're going to see some glaring omissions in coverage in newsrooms that don't make those critical hires, and they should be considered critical hires given the landscape that we know that we are about to head into. You know what I mean? I think there are lessons that we could learn from this political cycle about how, that we could apply to how we move forward in terms of the hiring and shifting of folks in newsrooms to cover politics going forward.
Karen, before you answer that, we're going to take questions now. So if you want to walk up to that mic in the middle aisle, we'd be happy to hear from you. Karen, go ahead.
I think it's really about process and standards and practices. For things to change, really, for 2020, it's about making it a priority. It can be dramatically changed, but it's only if it's financially incentivized and professionally incentivized at a senior level, in the same way that people saw what happened with Crazy Rich Asians, and that was a political thing. Deeply political, that they eliminated Hollywood's excuses for not casting Asians immediately, and that there was real financial incentive for people to stop using that excuse. And so if people see that there's if that excuse is eliminated and there are serious financial bonuses for changing the lineup in who is reporting on politics, or even at the local and at the national level, then I think that would ramp up the change considerably. But if they're still focused on the same standards and numbers regarding advertising and big names and big salaries of the same white guys, then really that's the only thing. And journalism has been slow to change for a long time. We're still using the same standards for like eyewitness news from 50 years ago. We're still using print newspapers have been printing the same size of paper for a long time. And look at what happened with the internet. It took a long time for people to really figure that was going to be a game changer too. So I don't want that to happen in regards to race and politics. But if the news industry's history has shown us anything, that it has been very slow to change for a long time.
I'm thrilled to see so many people lined up with questions. If you could just identify yourself and then again try to keep the question as brief as you can. Thank you very much.
I'm a little short. Hi, my name is Savannah Bailey McLean, and I do radio podcasting on creative arts. I first wanted to preference my question with the fact that this year is the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment, and I'm glad you brought that up a little bit because that dovetails into my question. Would it be helpful, because you kind of referenced it too, Ms. Ho, that we might need more historians in the newsrooms, because that would help bridge a lot of what goes on, including race. Because if you knew what happened at different time periods in this country's history, then you wouldn't worry about race. You would just be focused on the history and the facts. That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will just shout out my friend Jelani, who is a journalist and a historian, so double threat there. I think it's very useful. I think that the work that he's been doing has been effective primarily because he is able to provide historical context and foundation for everything that he is saying, and I think that that does make us smarter. I think that your point is exactly right, and you know, if I had it to do over again, I'd probably major in U.S. history.
Well, what's interesting also is the speed of the news cycle and the disincentive that gives editors to slow down and do these kind of stories that you're talking about. I mean, we're all on an amazing, very fast-moving treadmill, and we get sucked into whatever the latest thing that's trending on whatever. I completely agree with you, and I think these stories are they're more memorable and they're more important, and they teach us a lot more. But you almost have to be a fairly disciplined and confident writer and editor to say, you know what, we're going to let all this stuff pass, and we're going to focus on this that's longer term and is more important.
But still, I mean, I feel like writing about the intersection of race and politics, like, you almost can't do it without constantly thinking about history. I mean, so much of what we write about, we've seen before, we recognize before, especially in this moment. I mean, I have spent a lot of time in the past couple of years writing about milestone anniversaries, for example, and it's like not writing about them as a history lesson, but writing about them as they bear on our current moment. And so, yes, I think that history is very important in informing us in our jobs right now, and I think that has been true of journalism. And when we neglect to do that, I don't think that's a good idea.
Oral histories are already super popular. Like, we see them in pop culture all the time, like the 20th anniversary or the 10th anniversary of stuff. The thing that's interesting about birthright citizenship is it's an Asian American story, and a lot of that is trickling out. That people are learning that birthright citizenship is because of an Asian American who argued for it. I think I did not study history. I was fortunate enough to be a student of Jelani Cobb's here at the J School, and just that alone is something. So now I think about history constantly when I'm reporting, and it's about just like how I think about economics and business and the business of the media industry and how it's prompting these particular decisions, say, of the major television networks. I think it's another kind of perspective. I would love, of course, more time to study history, but I don't think you necessarily have to be a historian. You have to just have that as a consistent tool, just like a computer or a language in your reporting, to say, what is the historical precedent? This is not new. Something like this has happened before. And take the time just to find another source, to be search it up on Google. And I think that, in a checklist of things to do, just like making sure that you have a broad kind of sources and you spelled everybody's name correctly, just what is the historical precedent for this kind of declaration or this particular issue, and making that a standard and practice in your newsroom would benefit everyone, I think, for the short and long term. Right, so putting it in your checklist, every day, you're spelling the name, and then you're also checking off what is the historical precedent right after, did you spell everybody's name right? And also, did you only interview white men, or did you also interview women and minorities? It's did you check, is there a historical moment that's tied to this story? Is there a policy in history that set this housing initiative in place, or that led to this issue being brought up again? Just like in that list, just like when we do investigations or longer feature stories.
The cool thing about being a journalist is you don't have to be a historian. You can call one up, and more people should do that.
Hi, my name's John Ruttenberg. I work in tech, and in the past, when there's been criticism of tech companies about diversity issues, one of the responses has been, it's the pipeline problem. There aren't enough graduates in computer science or whatever to, fill these jobs and with a diverse workforce. So I'd like to know if the same kind of responses come from media companies, and also what an appropriate response to that would be.
Have you read the Me Too coverage of what it's like to be a female journalist going back 40 years? I mean, if we're talking about pipeline and retention, the very women who tried to, when people talk about the glory days of journalism, there's nobody who looks like us in those newsrooms, right? When you had lots of money to fly around the world and spend tons of money reporting a story, people like us didn't get those opportunities. And then, so the pipeline problem is also, we have historical documentation showing whenever even a white woman tried to get reporting responsibilities, she was driven out of prestigious magazines and newsrooms. So that cuts the excuse right away. And then there's also the fact that we know the numbers of people who are graduating in Ivy League schools, and like I said, if discrimination is the point of the practice right now, if the standard is eliminating a certain number of people and you refuse to change the standard, then that is the practice. And so there's no shortage of Ivy League grads who are journalists of color. And there's no shortage of people with incredible skills and perspectives and reporting, but that is not the practice, is to hire those people, or you have to make up all sorts of excuses. And I mean, the other thing is, it's just there are all sorts of reasons that newsrooms push out journalists like us, because you get tired of waiting to be promoted, you get tired of being paid less, you get tired of learning that your perspective isn't valued anymore, and then you see another place offering to pay you much more and give you a break from reading about the worst news of the day. So I think that's the three of us certainly know firsthand why that excuse or that reasoning is horrible, but it's also still it's still not made into a practice that is financially and professionally incentivized, that you need to make people like us a core part of the newsroom and the management level.
I think that there is a pipeline problem, but you solve it on the demand side, not the supply side. I also think that the pipeline problem is not as big of an obstacle as people make it out to be. Look, there are lots of HBCUs in this country, and at each HBCU there are dozens, if not hundreds, of kids who want to be journalists. And it's simply the case that excuse me, especially when it comes to high-end magazines, like the one I look for, traditionally they look for Ivy League grads. They look for people with English degrees from prestigious colleges. They don't necessarily look at an HBCU, and that's something that at the Atlantic we've encouraged our management to do, and I think that's something that any newsroom could do. If you want to find on the supply end, if you want to find people of color who want to be journalists, you have to look where they are, and they're there, but you have to actually want to hire them.
And I would add to that, I mean, the pipeline's not going to create itself, right? So if you have a pipeline problem, you need to look at your pipeline, and HBCUs are a fantastic way to create that pipeline. But also, looking at your programs that are getting people in the door, those apprenticeships, those fellowships, those internships that you're providing for folks. One, are you casting, a wide net, or are you going for the lowest hanging fruit, or your alma mater, or the alma mater of most of the people, who work in that newsroom? Are you asking, your already predominantly white newsroom for suggestions for, for interns? That's not going to create the pipeline that you want, right? And not only that, for those types of programs, frankly, for a lot of young people of color who would maybe like to get into our profession, if you are not paying those folks, that's a barrier. I mean, most students, young people of color, are going to need to make money in the summertime when they are not taking classes, or maybe while they are taking classes. They need to make money while they are doing this. They don't have family or other resources to fall back on, and do this for little or even no money. in major media markets. That's just not an option, or even a market that is away from their hometown. They don't have that as an option. So paying those young people too, so that they can get the experience that they need, to Karen's point, to actually build a resume, to be able to be competitive is something that needs to be that people need to think about as well.
I mean, I did almost smile when you said that, because we, for this issue, talked to a lot of newsrooms and trying to address why they haven't done anything about this problem, and that was the first word out of their mouth almost all the time. Well, it's a pipeline problem. And then to your point, like, you can change the pipeline. This isn't a passive thing. Partly it's like not depending on the whisper network of friends to fill jobs, like really making an effort to open it up, so you're not like just hiring people that the existing staff already knows, because the problem in terms of diversity is the existing staff.
Hi, my name is Michael McDowell. First of all, thank you all so much. Two questions, really the same question, I think, but I was scanning the Daily 202 this morning, which opened with McCaskill-Hawley, race in Missouri, and you see the emergence of this narrative about realignment, depending on how the Republicans do tomorrow. So I want to ask you, one, realignment versus success of voter suppression efforts and how that relates to coverage of race in the media. And two, Karen, really interesting point you made, shame is not enough. How do we talk about racism and racially charged rhetoric when shame is not enough? Thanks.
Sorry, could you explain what you mean by realignment?
Basically that you're seeing a generational shift in the politics of Truman voters who would have been Truman Democrats suddenly becoming Trump Republicans. That was the point that opened the piece.
I kind of think that happened 50 years ago.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
White Democrats started drifting away from the Democratic Party after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act. So I think, this is, to the extent that the election in Missouri tomorrow represents that, it's not something that happened in the last 2 years or because of Trump. And that's another thing that I think people need to keep in mind, is not everything that happens is because of Trump. Some of it predates him. And it's actually misleading your readers to suggest that he came up with all this stuff.
Ushering in a new phenomenon, right? Yeah. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question?
So, yeah.
How to talk about racism when shame is not enough? Yes. I mean, there are some people for whom shame is never going to be enough, right? And frankly, I don't write for those people. Like, I'm not going to reach those people. But I think that what is critically important for me, anyway, in writing about race and racism is, that we are here to bear witness. I mean, you think about the people that came before us who wrote about these types of issues. They weren't necessarily believed or celebrated, or, they certainly didn't end racism, with their work, but they were there to report what happened, and they gave us the historical record that we have now about the time that they lived through. Like, without them, like, we would not have that. Without reporters who are writing about race and racism right now, generations that come after us aren't going to know what happened right now. So even if folks are not shamed today by, the racism that frankly is, continuing to exist in our society, just because people aren't ashamed, that certainly doesn't mean that we can't shrink away from it. That we should shrink away from it. Like, we still have a job to do, regardless of how people react, and like, we can't really worry about whether or not we're going to cure it, and in letting that determine whether or not we do our job. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I use money. Money is the best way for me to get my revenge on everybody. No, it's great. Nobody can argue with money. So, like, every time I've written a story that incorporated race unabashedly and part of my own identity, it has been a bestseller. Both of my big breaks have been bestsellers. There is something to be about your competitive advantage. We saw this with not just culture stories about movies like Black Panther, when you had, or, cover stories. There was that great cover story in GQ about Mahershala Ali with Carvel Wallace. And he was able to get great reporting and perspective on a really important actor of our time who is openly Muslim. And that was a great seller for GQ. Every time I have written about race and politics in entertainment or in business or about news, it has done very well. And that is the only way right now, is to continue to do that. I tweet a lot about how I wish I could shame other people into changing their stuff, but quite honestly, I think it's more effective for people to see how much my work is both selling magazines and getting readers, to show people why it's important to continue to do, and also to start conversations that show that I'm not the only person who's thinking about this and who cares about this, and I'm backing it up with reporting and research, and this is not just an opinion. It didn't come from nowhere. And having those numbers, bragging about the magazines that I sold, the viewers that I've brought in, that is hard to ignore. When I do that consistently, and when I cite other examples of when my journalists of color peers have done the same thing, that makes it very hard because nobody wants to turn down money. And that's unfortunately sometimes the plainest way to change minds, is to show people consistently that failing to do so means that they are going to lose in the short and the long term.
So what you're saying is, once again, Beyonce was right. The best revenge is your paper.
Oh,
that's the takeaway here.
Yes, but I cannot quote Beyonce because that is not my lane, and I need to earn my ticket to the cookout. That's everybody's lane.
I would just say that, I don't see my job as shaming anybody. My job is to write the truth as best that I can as I see it. And I get a lot of email from Trump supporters who say, oh, I didn't like Trump before, but now that I've read your article, I'm going to vote for Trump. I'm like, okay, well, I think you've fundamentally misunderstood what my job is. I'm not trying to persuade anyone. I'm not trying to shame anyone. My job is literally just to write things down as best I see them, what is happening. And, if you're not convinced that racism is bad after reading my work, okay, well, that wasn't the point. And if you, either way, it doesn't matter to me. What I'm just trying to say is that this is what's happening, this is why it's happening, and this is why you should care. But, as far as, persuading people that, racism is bad and it hurts people, if you don't already believe that, then nothing I say is going to convince you. So it's just not something I'm concerned with.
Yes, sir.
I'm Ken Siegel. I'm a retired school teacher. The main purpose of the Fourth Estate, the journalism, is to speak truth to power. That's what the Fourth Estate is supposed to be doing, as you know. Well, it seems to me time and time again, the journalists don't speak truth to power because it will upset the ideological established status quo. The examples I give you here, 6 quick examples.
Can we just have 3?
The battleship Maine, I'll do this, that's number 1. Number 2, the sinking of the Lusitania, started the First World War. 3, Pearl Harbor. 4, in Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin.
Right,
5, I'm almost finished.
Okay.
Iraq,
Quickly.
Yellow Cake, weapons of mass destruction. And 6, 9/11. These are all false flags. The evidence is there for those investigative journalists that want to look at it.
9/11 wasn't a false flag, sir. I'm sorry.
Sir, jet fuel, the fires of jet fuel don't melt steel buildings.
That's correct, but jet fuel melts other things that burn hot enough to burn steel.
No,
Can you
sir.
please let
Right.
someone else speak?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure, and this is what I mean. You're afraid to speak truth to
I'm not
power.
afraid. I'm irritated. That's a different emotion.
So that was a lot, but so hi, I'm Jake,
What's your
and
name?
I'm unemployed, so that's exciting. I didn't graduate from Columbia, but I did graduate from like a very prestigious like private university on the East Coast. And an earlier story you talked about, it reminded me when I was in college as a part of my school's newspaper about how there was a diversity panel that was filled with these very established and like award-winning black journalist to this crowd of like 50 white people and like three Asians basically. And they brought all these great ideas of how to diversify the upper echelons of my school's newspaper. However, right after, a lot of the people, especially on the editorial board, were often very dismissive of their ideas, such as block parties or engaging with basically like minority groups on campus. And unfortunately, as of that time, I was not in a position of power enough to really kind of get to them and really talk to them. So in that way, how do you convince kind of like white women and white men in those positions of power to listen to an esteemed group of people and advice on diversifying as opposed to just flippantly putting away? Because it was for journalists with like very strong credentials, like leading, what was it, like new bylines? Like how do you kind of relate to that?
Are you still in proximity to your alma mater?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I said, are you still in proximity to your alma mater?
No, it was in DC.
Well, honestly, I mean, I feel like you could be a great recruiter for young people who were in the same position as you, looking around, not seeing that many people in the newsroom who looked like you, knowing that there needed to be more, but not really knowing how to make that happen. Like, there are so many young people on college campuses who do not even envision that this is a possibility for them, right? Like, yeah. I grew up in Atlanta. Everybody in a position of power, authority, whatever, was black, from the mayor to the people that told me the news every night at 6 o'clock. So like, I knew that journalism was an option for me by the time I got to school, and that was what I wanted to do, even though my college certainly would not have given me, that impression. So, these young people, and and you are not, you look at least like you are not that far removed from the college experience. And so, even if you can't get back to your alma mater, just letting young people know, or figuring out a way, whether it's on social media or whatever, encouraging them to apply for roles at that school newspaper, so that and why that's important, and why and how they can be meaningful and impactful, or at least planting the seed. Maybe they don't know what they want to do yet, right? And so the school newspaper is an option. Maybe journalism is something that they could be thinking about for the first time as a result of something that you said. If the white editors at that paper don't want to do it, you do it. I mean, I know it should not be the job of people of color to do this all the time, but frankly, I tend to not wait on folks to try to make that happen. I mean, I want to be able to at least say that I did my part too.
Sometimes you get tired of waiting for someone else to stick their neck out, and it's really awkward, and you might not feel ready, but sometimes you can see the problem and you can see how it can be fixed, and you don't have to. You can take different steps to changing it for other people, and reminding yourself that you're not just doing it for yourself, and that you could, there is a long tail of impact that you can have by making that step. Can give you the motivation and confidence to do that, and also reaching out to resources so that you're not alone and you don't feel as isolated. There are a lot of online groups that can give you that kind of support, and other student journalists who can help you answer a lot of your questions, or who have gone through that same experience, and so you don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel all over again.
Thank you, and 9/11 wasn't a false flag.
Hi, how are you? This is a little high for me.
Hello.
Sorry. I'm short. I'm Danielle, and I work at Vice. I'm an editor there.
Awesome.
And my question is, I specifically thinking about Trump and race coverage. I remember in 2016, there was a lot of talk about pop culture and the way that it kind of irresponsibly, in some ways, covered Trump's campaign and kind of jokingly mocked it, and then it became a serious thing. My issue, or my sort of challenge in working at Vice, is our audience tends to be younger, and they kind of got like Trump fatigue at this point. And so my question is, how do we cover Trump responsibly from the pop culture gaze, without sort of like trivializing a lot of the things that he's doing? Because again, younger readers like quick reads. They don't like a lot of, they don't like longer pieces. They want to kind of easily digest things. But I'm always curious, like the best practice for covering Trump in that lane.
I mean, I think context is important. I think even if you're trying to write a quick piece for someone who's reading on their phone, I think you want to provide them with the resources necessary that if they want to learn more about it, they can easily find it from whatever piece that you're publishing. So maybe you don't want to write 4,000 words on the history of immigration policy in the United States, but you can certainly link to someone else or something else that offers more context on it. But I think that you've identified a problem that is very difficult and that I don't think newsrooms have really figured out. I mean, how to keep young people engaged in important things without alienating them or boring them is something that every newsroom in every generation is going to have to deal with. And I don't think there's like a simple solution to it, but that's that would be my observation.
And it doesn't have to be long to be impactful. I mean, you know that. And frankly, the way that even journalists consume news, like our attention span is not that long. And frankly, we just don't have the bandwidth, given everything that is going on a daily basis in this country. We don't have the bandwidth often to read those long pieces unless they're written by Adam. But given that, really, I would say the main way to grab those folks, make it about them. Like whatever the issue is, if you can somehow explain to them, this is how this is going to affect you, or let me show you somebody who looks like you, who is the face of this issue that I want to talk about, then they're sucked in. Then they want to know more because they're like, oh wait, I should care about this. Like somebody who looks like me is being affected, or somebody who's my age, or somebody I might know would be affected by this. I think that's really that's really what grabs all of us.
Following what they said, don't underestimate the power of an anecdotal lead. So policy stuff, it's like if it's immigration, it's a young person, it's a student who looks like a potential reader or a viewer, and it's like they finished grad school and they want to move to the United States, and they're someone who could be your friend in grad school or an undergrad, and they're finding it extraordinarily difficult to pay for a visa or convince an employer to keep them in the country. That right way, then you have that emotional connection, and you can summarize that in a short and a long way. There's a lot of increasing great coverage about women's issues. So access to things like birth control, abortion, IUDs, those are issues that a lot of young people care about right now. What does that mean in terms of healthcare policy? Will they have to pay out of pocket? All of that stuff. Really, and just finding someone who's willing to tell their story so that they can help other people is a really easy way in and grabs people, and has been one of the few things that continues to be great no matter what kind of medium you use it for.
And just last point on that, and I'm sure you probably already know this. I hope I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but I mean, you young folks love the video and photos. I mean, like that's what's going to suck people in. Instagram stories, Facebook stories, to promote the journalism that you are doing. Somebody sees somebody, they're more likely to click on a picture or a video and maybe even read the top of the story if they've got that to go with it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayami Hatanaka. I'm from the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem. Hi. So my question is really thinking about, you guys talked about what stories are not being covered, but more so about why those stories are not being covered. So I'm particularly thinking about the rise in coverage on police brutality and police violence, particularly on Black and brown communities. And in my work, I work a lot with parents and families who are being separated by ACS and Child Protective Services, and that's something that's obviously has a historical through, speaking of historical through lines, is something that is, coming from the way that slavery has operated and the ways in which genocide has been perpetuated on Native communities. And so I'm thinking about, some stories have kind of explosive moments and some seem to not, and the separation of Black and brown families, particularly in communities that we're in right now, have long existed before sort of the rise of Trump. And so I'm wondering, first, why these stories aren't covered, and secondly, how and what can be done to excavate those stories.
Don't get mad at me for saying this, Adam, but I mean, frankly, you could tie it to Trump. I mean, we're talking about family separations, right? So this is the untold story of family separations. Is it going to get people's attention? Yes. Like, if things that are told through the prism of Trump, unfortunately, like that is a driver, or at least it's going to get our editor's attention. I mean, framing it in a conversation about family separation would be a way for you to get that story out. because frankly, a lot of what we do is through that prism right now.
The Associated Press did an investigation into the children of undocumented immigrants being adopted by white families, and the peg was Trump, but it was actually about examples of things that happened during the Obama administration, which I think is important also for liberal readers who think that, Obama was all, sugar and spice and flowers and rainbows, to learn that that's not actually ever been true of the U.S. government. So, I mean, I think, far from being mad at Erin, I think she's actually onto something.
The other thing is you have to continue. The problem is also, what is the new angle is unfortunately a question that editors ask all the time. So if you have to figure out a way to say, editors will be like, okay, we already know about child separations. So what is the new thing about this child separation? That will get people's attention and get them to stop whatever else that they're doing to read your story or pay attention and spend the time to get to know the families involved. And that is something that is honestly a problem even when it comes to the issue of diversity. Like, newsrooms feel like they know that story already, that it's a big problem. And that's why to figure out a new angle to get them to care about it is also one of the reasons why we haven't seen these numbers move dramatically. And so until it's sort of like somebody's pet project or something they care about, that's, if you're pitching this story, that's the thing to highlight at the very top, is what is the most important new thing, the new development that should get people to really care about, both at the news editors level and from the general public. That's the approach that I would do.
Thank you.
We have time for one more, but is it a problem that the vast majority of the stories that most of us are doing are somehow tied to Trump?
I mean, I am expected to write about politics, so I think that's unavoidable. I mean, like, during the Obama years, everything was tied to Obama for me. So, I mean, I think it depends, what your beat is, but I think if you're not immediately tied to politics, I think, yes, that might be a problem.
Yeah. I mean, most of what I've been writing about since I got this job has been the intersection of race and politics. So most of what I write about is Trump adjacent, at the very least.
I mean, I also cover business and culture now. And business and culture is really about what's going on in our lives and money and movies and stuff like that. And it is, in many ways, still tied to politics, right? Like, businesses are reacting to Trump's statements regarding trade and international relations and whether or not they're going to be able to sell their goods or their people are going to be safe or going to be able to travel. And what does that mean in regards to investors abroad, or even if their people can live and work here? And then in regards to culture, it's sort of like, what are people seeking out in response to the current politics, right? Like, it's not an accident that the most popular TV show, which is The Good Place, is deeply about morality and ethics, and about, like, what do you need to do on a daily basis in order to be a good person. That is deeply tied to the politics of our time. But I think it's in terms of selling as a freelancer, and also in terms of and my potential hireability, it is really about understanding what is going on in politics, and that is a problem because it has consumed everybody in a way that I think has made everyone really tired in a way that can't be healthy, because people still have to take their kids to school and do all the normal stuff of life in the backdrop of all of what's going on.
So we have one more question, which is going to be the best question. So there's no pressure on you.
My name is Gabe Schneider. I'm a freelance journalist, and I graduated in June. And I'm coming from a university where a majority of the journalists are students of color, so I'm wondering, what advice do you have for those journalists?
Oh man, I got to make this answer a good one because you have such a good Twitter handle. It's the ghost of college affordability, in case y'all want to look that up. I enjoy it very much. What I would tell you is, don't underestimate. I know that people, tend to give younger journalists a bad rap, but you guys bring something to the table that is so important and so timely right now. I mean, I think about the expertise that you have just through lived experience as a young person around gun culture, for example. around millennials and voter apathy. I mean, you are poised to write about 2020 right now if that's what you want to do, right? Because you can be focused specifically on millennials if that's what you want to do. Issues around housing and student loans. I mean, like, there are so many issues right now that are in our national conversation that young people are poised to write about with expertise, because you live it, you know it, and you can speak with authority about it. And that's the beginning of yes, you need a great editor, and yes, you need guidance as you are starting in your budding career as a journalist, but don't undervalue your ability to come with ideas and stories that are going to resonate with not only with your peers, but to the rest of us who frankly have not lived that experience. Just because you are young. Being young, I think, is an asset in a lot of ways for you in terms of the type of journalism that you can do right now.
I think that I have two pieces of advice that I give to young journalists. One is, do not write about yourself. The personal essay industrial complex will encourage you. It will give you money to write about yourself. It is the easiest way to get a paycheck for writing immediately coming up. The second piece of it, but don't do it.
No, because your Google searches are going to be trash. They're going to be trash.
The second thing is, find something you're interested in, become obsessed with it, learn everything you can about it, learn who else is obsessed with it and knows everything possible about it, and start writing about that thing. And if you can't find someone to pay you to write about it, you should start your own blog and write about it from there. And look, it's not so much, the idea is not to turn you into Perez Hilton, you're getting like 1 million hits or whatever. The idea is to get good at writing about that thing that is not you. And those are the two main pieces of advice I have.
I mean, aside from, I think it's really important to think about stories in a way that like everybody's attention is so disparate right now, and really think hard about when you're writing it, whether you're reporting or especially as a journalist of color, because I often talk to them, is think about your critics right away. Because it's very easy for them to say, oh, this is just an opinion. You're like, by the way, here's a Harvard Business Review study backing up this thought that I have about this report, or here's a point in history that says, my opinion about the current event is tied to a long-standing history of racism or practices regarding discrimination of a particular ethnic group or even young people. And then think about how you're adding to the context in which everybody's thinking about the world, and that what you're doing is part of a much larger body of work. To what Adam said, you're trying to figure out something, you're starting something that people will look back for, and many years from now, people will look up what your early work was like, and thinking about that eliminates your desire to get like quick hits about goofy stories about your life, but also thinking about what is the long tail of what I want to uncover, which is, I think, something more people need to think about, because too many news stories and news projects are too much about the short term, and more people need to think about the long term of their work.
Thank you. This was a terrific conversation. It was a treat to hear everybody up here. Thank you for listening and for your questions. We're going to pause sorry?
I just said thank you for coming.
We're going to pause just long enough to get us off and let Jelani and Lydia come up. So grab a drink or a cup of coffee, come right back, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Very straightforward.
I saw Jelani. When that dude came in, and I was like, no, you need to get out of here.
I'm not. Patience has never been my strongest. Sir, you have to go. Well, I'm going to stay for this panel. Hey. How are you? Hey, how are you? Great to see you. You saw it was like very emotional. Hey, how's it going? Yeah, I'm going to do I know. Crazy, normal. Yeah. You know, just like typical crazy, normal Trump era. Family drama, blah, blah. How have you been? Good, good. Yeah. I'm gonna run to the restroom. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I can't stay because I'm giving a talk. But let's.
Pretty good. Well, it's always it, like, I'm also aggressively like first. I'm to be quite honest. I don't I just like trying to help right now, but I think it's I've heard you hear about same conversation and also yes. These are I think they're hard. I'm just thinking about all of like my checking work, you know, like the last week in particular. Oh yeah. And oh yeah. But also, which is the tricky part. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So they've finally changed it to after they had great feedback. No, you're wrong. I'll move. And so we're making these instruments what is, and they changed it to proper. And so we're making series. Yeah, agreed. Yes, I to me. It's not his fault. He's fine, but he definitely. You can say that with me. But like seriously, like not consistent. Yeah. And it's very two days, and then I kind of took it out and I retweeted it, and I was like, I'm not retweeting the story that I think it makes me feel this. So it's like first phase to the last one.
Again, I just want to say hi. I'm from Toronto.
Oh,
so I just
yes. Like everyone in the day school is like, you're from Toronto. And I'm like, what? Okay. It's like,
that's really funny. I didn't know you said that. I got to
oh, that's awesome. No, I did ops management training and finance at SEMA. I did the MA in business journalism, so I was at SEMA. Yeah, and then I opted to oh my god, like that's why I talk a lot about procedures and practices because I'm like, you know, like everything is like from making cranberries and like making a new story or something different. It's just like the and I always I'm incredibly grateful that I took ops management and accounting for finance because it was like I was terrified to take it in school and then they're like, no, you're gonna take it to like work with the World Bank. And I was like, yes, that's fine.
social
Yeah.
actually, I think you. Wait, when
Garrett. I think it's for. Oh yeah. So I know your business crew. That's fine. But yeah, are you still based in New York? No. So I know. There's 4 right now. I know. Well, and I think it'll be nice to have to. How are you? Some of these were like the time cover was the biggest deal. You did it. Oh my god. And I was like, has there been a? And I was like, oh no. Yeah. But the most important thing is like your name. Yes, you know. Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. No, that's great because like we're stressful thing. No, that was like I honestly I felt like kind of like proud, like I felt like a boss. A lot of people. Oh really? Okay. I was like, I don't really know. No, it's fine. But also I'm studying in like and so it's interesting to me that you well, it was because
oh my god, that's gonna be great.
And now I'm so flexible. And so I didn't want to be and I had.
Yeah, exactly.
Another Canadian that was first. So
oh wait,
I did it that way. But I waited.
I'm pre-party.
And so earlier so I was able to come back first week of January. So like I left my OPT ended the middle of July, and then I moved back to Toronto on August 1st. And so I come back every 6 months with my boyfriend. So we had some like I come back to see the school and advise students and all this stuff. But and then they were looking to get to town, and I was like,
oh, you do? Oh yeah, for the travel thing. Oh yeah, it's not a big deal, but no, it's trust me.
That's what I'm about. And I only thought it's better. Anyway, thank you so much. Just want to make a Toronto. Please, like, give me. I'll get to it. Okay. Oh yes, of course. Hi. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And there's always
I missed most of the last panel. I was part of the caucus. Yeah, exactly. I'm sure am. I'm living somebody's. I enjoy the work. It's just what I got into a smooth there's this strategy that we're working on, sense of strategy that I was just like, why? It's like that kind of thing. You know, it's super boring to talk about, like when you're trying to get stuff right? When you're I got more paperwork today.
Right.
There's like tomorrow.
Right. And I mean, that's fine. But that's
no. Trust me. I'm very aware. There's times like this where you get another just fight. I get extraordinarily frustrated. 25 years. Yeah, I already feel through. I have one very much. It's already so just but
you're doing mine.
It's just formatting. But I thought the section was excellent. You know, like that section with like quick hits of who's going on. And the Washington Post already did know you know, like there was something in democracy versus and then where was the Washington Post much better
things like this, right? Like, and so think about this. It's also and so right. Yeah. Like
Oh, that's right. That's interesting in the election.
That's not what my primary concern is. Shifted a little bit where we have over the what is that? Yeah, it's just so we shifted a little bit in terms of time.
Really appreciate your time. Like, it wasn't that long ago.
I was honestly,
like it's still.
How can you not do that?
I'm ready.
There's probably very little promotional value to it, but I said like a lot of great scene setting value. So I'll go up. I'll go about 5 minutes.
I say I don't know how long I'm saying it because I basic measures. I'm actually not. I don't miss being on air as much as exactly. Yep. I like being out there. And it's, so, but what I'm really trying to do is spec out whether there are ways to combine philanthropic sources of funding. But that's the thing, foundation endowment is investments in the service of because journalism philanthropic dollars a tiny it's pretty hard to move the needle with philanthropic money, but if you can figure out ways to for philanthropy to come through like other forms of money, I think even the whole system is it's the for-profit, not-for-profit revenue generating of the endowment. So you're expected to make money. How you're expected to make money is supposed to be linked to the program. So can you newsrooms to get investments from that is actually expected corporate social responsibility funds. So it's getting me into like trying to analyze how things get done.
Hello? Excuse me. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. Seriously?
We need a little energy from the
Right.
crowd up here, so yes. Thank
So
you.
this is the thing, like when you have like a teacher in the room, they will just repeat it until they get the response they want. So be like, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. Isn't that much better? Okay. So we are happy to continue the conversation. My name is Jelani Cobb, and I had the really wonderful honor of being the guest editor of this issue. And it was great working with the CJR staff and all the great contributors, as well as Kyle, who I think has done a wonderful job with Columbia Journalism Review. And one of the high points is that I get to have this conversation with Lydia Polgreen, who is the editor-in-chief of Huffington Post, formerly a reporter at the New York Times, and we were just kind of going over the very many themes and directions that this conversation could go in. And I think there's one, speaking, I guess, temporally, there's one thing that just kind of leaps out, which is the fact that this is the 10th anniversary, more or less, of the election of Barack Obama. And there was this narrative of post-raciality that came up, and it was kind of like, well, like the Halloween movies have come back, and it's like Michael Myers, who can't be killed, neither could that post-racial idea at the time, and then it popped up, and people are going like, people are not saying that much anymore, shockingly. But we have a whole other set of euphemisms, you know, racially tinged, racially charged, economic anxiety, and so on. And I'd like to start by asking about the way that the media handles race and the way that those dynamics come about. Like, where does this come from, this kind of artificial language in the way that we talk about this subject?
I mean, I think the true opiate of the American people is amnesia. We are just I was just interviewed by a reporter from the SABC in South Africa, and I was a reporter in South Africa for a couple of years, and South Africa's process of truth and reconciliation was deeply flawed and incomplete, but at least they had one, right? At least there was an effort to grapple with, genocide and apartheid and, the horrific injustice that the minority wreaked on the majority there. I'm going to back up a little bit because I basically missed the Obama administration. I spent most of it in working as a reporter in West Africa, India, and then South Africa. And I returned to the United States in kind of the golden twilight of the Obama years. I was here for, I think, the last 18 months of his administration. And it reminded me of nothing so much as my initial stint as the South Asia correspondent in India when I had landed, and the Congress Party, which is the more liberal party in India, had just been reelected, and everybody thought, wow, this horrible virus of the hardcore Hindu right that had wreaked so much damage on India, that had been permanently buried and put to bed. This was over. It was impossible to imagine that that government could, that philosophy could come back to power. The guy who seemed like the most likely next leader of the BJP, which is the sort of Hindu right party, he was so thoroughly tarnished by these horrific riots that had happened in Gujarat. There was just no way that, the guy couldn't even get a visa to come to the United States. He was such a pariah. And so there was just this extraordinary period of elite complacency and of people thinking the good guys have won and this is permanent. We have vanquished this beast. And then the 3 years that I spent in India was essentially chronicling the kind of that dream just dying, and realizing that there were these forces that had not gone away at all. They were just kind of lying in wait. So I had a weird sense of deja vu when I came back to the United States in the twilight of the Obama years, when everybody had this kind of loosey-goosey feeling of, oh, you know, we've kind of crossed over to the other side now. We've gotten to this place where we're never going to end up back where we were. We've made too much progress now. And it was in the teeth of that complacency, I think, that we saw, I think, really deeply flawed coverage of the 2016 election on so many different fronts. And I think that it really does come back to that sense of amnesia, that desire that we have to drink laudanum and forget our past, and think that we've come so far and it's impossible for us to slide back. But our history has been one of, you know, going forward 2 steps, going back 4 steps, going forward 6 steps, going back 2 steps. And I think that just as I saw in India, so I saw here in the United States that that the past really never is past, and that these issues of division, of racial competition, of prejudice, of exclusion, they're just as present today as they've ever been in our history, if not more so. And so I think that a largely white political press corps saw what was happening in 2016 and thought, nah, it's just not going to happen. And then it did. And I think that the puncturing of that illusion of progress, of forward motion, particularly on the issue of race, is it really lies at the root of the most atrocious sins that journalists have committed in the past couple of years.
I mean, I think it seems, tell me if I'm wrong here, that a lot of the kind of grand narrative making, which is always troublesome, but it seems that the grand narratives around these issues, particularly race, have a tendency to reflect whatever balms the conscience of a particular middle-class white reporter collective. And I think you were talking about this in terms of like what you saw in the coverage, I mean, what you literally saw in the coverage in 2016.
No, I mean, so at the time, and I don't mean to pick on the New York Times, but that's where I spent most of my career. I think the same thing could have unfolded at any major newsroom. But at the time, I was working on a completely separate project, expanding the international audience of the New York Times. But my office was right next to where all the political reporters for the New York Times sat. And you know, becoming a political reporter who covers a presidential campaign is a really big deal at the New York Times. It's a very prestigious job to have. It's something that they tend to groom people for over time. You start out covering local politics in New York, and then you graduate to covering national races. And I realized at one point, looking out, that essentially everybody covering the 2016 presidential race was white. And now, it'd be one thing if you just kind of, in just a moment, thought, oh, you know, let's just grab whoever we have and put them in these jobs. But it's a painstaking process. You know, people are groomed over time to take these roles, and then eventually, if you cover the winning candidate, you end up going to become a White House correspondent. So this is a major career moment. So it was just striking to me, looking around the room and seeing that the people who'd been selected and groomed for this very, very prestigious role in a newsroom that is not undiverse, just all happened to be white, and it was really surprising. And eventually, they did hire Yamiche Alcindor, a very, very talented political reporter, and I think there were a couple of other people who came on to the reporting staff kind of late in the game. But the fact that that hadn't been built into the plans for staffing the 2016 race from the beginning, and that when that process of mentoring and grooming had started, that somehow people of color fell out of the equation was really sad. And like I said, I'm not trying to pick on the New York Times here. I think that that's the same thing that you would see in many newsrooms, and it's not out of lack of good intent. I mean, I'm a product of the really aggressive efforts that the New York Times has made to diversify its newsroom over the years. But man, that was disappointing.
With also, I guess, some tangible implications in terms of that coverage. I guess I would ask, like, what were things that you saw that were not covered to the degree that they should have been covered, covered incorrectly? I guess, what were the implications of that? Not necessarily at the Times, but just like more broadly speaking.
Well, I mean, I think there's a variety of things. I mean, I think one really unexplored story in the 2016 cycle was the troubled relationship between the Democratic Party and the African American voter base on which, you know, its coalition is founded. That I felt was a problem. But like, I think also just a fundamental failure to take Donald Trump's racism seriously. I think that was probably the largest and most troubling failure of the 2016 race. And I think that unless, and what's remarkable is that there were a handful of reporters, almost all of them African American or people of color in general, who did see that peril very early on and very clearly, and tried to, you know, blink the flashing red lights. But you know, I think there's a deep discomfort in this country about calling things what they are when it comes to race. We love the term, you know, we use the term racially charged, you use, you know, racially tinged. I mean, there are a bunch of others. You spoke about economic
inflammatory,
anxiety.
right, yeah, sure.
Inflammatory,
yeah.
You know. But look, it's only getting worse, right? I mean, this is an example from gender rather than from race, but I remember when I got the push alert that Brett Kavanaugh had been confirmed, you know, because I'm a journalist, I get push alerts from like 5 zillion news organizations. It's just one after the other. Usually HuffPost is first. Thank you very much. But all of the push alerts said, had like slightly different takes on it. And so the New York Times and the Washington Post and other kind of like big legacy news organizations had something like Brett Kavanaugh confirmed after a bitter partisan battle, right? Our push alert, the push alert for BuzzFeed, and I don't remember, there were probably a couple of others who took this tack, said Brett Kavanaugh confirmed after being accused of sexual assault, right? Now, I can see how an editor at the New York Times or at the Washington Post is like, you know, it's a push alert, it's short, it's not gonna have a lot of context to it, we can't get into the nuance, so let's just be kind of general about it. We don't want to be perceived as being biased one way or the other. The problem is that in doing that, they effectively adopted the Republican talking point, which is that this wasn't about sexual assault, this was just a partisan fight. That is not a neutral statement. That is actually taking sides. It's saying that, you know, throw up your hands, it's all about politics rather than about an allegation of sexual assault. So that's the kind of thing that I think you see over and over and over again, is that even though right now we're living in a moment of like deep, like very, very right in front of your face racial crisis, there is a kind of opposing force to frankness, which is largely journalistic reputation management. You know, it's news organizations not wanting to seem like they're taking a side. They want to, you know, and of course we're living in an environment where it's fake news, it's bias, it's this, and it's not just journalists, it's also technology platforms, right? I mean, every day I get these tweets that Kevin Roose of the New York Times does that are a look at what are the most popular stories on Facebook on whatever the hot button issue is of the day, and for the Caravan, it's Fox News, it's Ben Shapiro, it's Breitbart, you know, like maybe there'll be like a TMZ story or something like that in there. But you have this crisis of institutions that are so afraid of being tagged as partisan that they're essentially being derelict in their duty to just tell the truth. And that to me is deeply, deeply problematic. And I think that's a big part of how we got to where we are right now.
So one of, I guess, the interesting things about the both sidesism, and it's been a lens through which I've understood a lot of this, which has been around, even I think before the election, but people were saying that the reporters were conflicted because the Trump voter was, you know, a family member of theirs, and, you know, they're related to people who think this way and so on, which I dismissed. And I thought that was a very pat kind of way of analyzing a complicated phenomenon. And then the election happened, and I became like, I don't know, I guess like the Negro whisperer, Like, because I mean, white colleague after white colleague came up and told me, well, I'm not speaking to my family members. I didn't go home for Thanksgiving. Some people were saying, I haven't been home in a year, like much later. I was in, let me not give identifying details here. Let's just say I was in a significant gathering in which I was the only black person, and I felt like Oprah.
I guess I wasn't available that night.
Right, exactly. It was like the confessional, the confessional Negro. And so there's that kind of dynamic, which I actually wonder, like, how much that does factor into like how this conversation is had. Like, if your people are feeling implicated because you're also talking about your Uncle Leo, that's a very different kind of narrative too.
Totally, and I think that I was talking with Adam Serwer earlier, and we were talking about particularly about Andrew Gillum, and this I think is actually a really interesting, and we should get into Andrew and the coverage of him, Gillum and the coverage of him a little bit later, but. One of the things that I think is remarkable about his political rise, and why I think that he may hold the key to a winning coalition in the southern United States, is that he like speaks in an idiom that is like deeply American. That your uncle whoever, talking about kick dog gonna holler, like this kind of authenticity, and I wonder if like the bigger takeaway is that there is almost this kind of symbolic alliance between people who have this like kind of cultural affinity to one another, and that the divide between the people at that dinner party and the people back home is less that like I'm like morally pure. It's just that they're educated and they move to a city and they have a some fancy white collar job that brings them to a dinner party like the one that you just described, and that like Uncle Rob or whoever actually could find himself face to face with someone who is a lot like Andrew Gillum and move past whatever this kind of this sort of moment of Trumpism has brought us to. So I mean, like, that's like one slightly hopeful way to think about it. But we've all been that like magical Negro, right? That one who's in there to kind of invited to a dinner party to help the nice white liberals feel better about the state of the country, right? Like, I go to these all the time. We should coordinate our calendars so we can divide and conquer.
Exactly.
But
it's like, wait, are you going to the one on the 15th?
But I think that just speaks to this like deep guilt and shame that we have in this country, and those who are awake enough to know that they should have guilt and shame, like, good for them, but they also need to take action, and they should probably have more black friends than just you.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of want to spread it out some. But I think there's another element of this too, which is that there is at least seemingly a cognizance of this in some arenas. So I remember going back again 10 years ago when Obama was elected, and I think that there was a moment in which outlets were looking around and saying, there are more black people living in the White House than working for this publication or working for this, this show. And you saw a kind of cluster of voices that were emerging, I think, that got an opportunity to talk at that point. And then I think it just, toward the end of the Obama era, started to disappear. The most kind of visible example was MSNBC, where I think they referred to it as the unblackening, in which Touré left and Melissa Harris Perry left, right. And then Tamron Hall left in service of hiring Megyn Kelly, which right. was.
That didn't really work out.
Really? It did? I was thinking that was such a brilliant move on their part. But in any case, I think that there was the kind of the element of like being the boulder that rolls up the hill and then rolls back down. And I wonder if you have any insight into how these changes become more institutionalized and more permanent.
I mean, I think that look, TV news is part of the problem, not part of the solution, right? I mean, people complain about social media being the driver of division in our country, but I think it is a necessary but not sufficient. And the thing that makes it sufficient is the existence of cable television news. And getting into a period where, you know, cable TV seems to think that it needs to have a shouter from the left and a shouter from the right, rather than, you know, great professional broadcast, you know, reporting talent, definitely gets us to the place where we lose smart analytical voices. I mean, look, why is it that, you know, Rachel Maddow, you know, stays and Melissa Harris, you know, Perry goes? I think that's a really great question to ask, and I don't understand the answer to it. But I think that it has a lot to do with the complexion of our politics and the moving on from the Obama era and thinking, okay, now we're going on to something else. We're getting back to politics as usual, and we want people on TV who look like the politicians who are running this country. I think that's an element of it. But look, I also think that when it comes to major roles in journalism, people of color are held to this extraordinarily high standard, which, as they should be. I mean, everybody who has a leadership role should be held to a high standard. But I remember having a conversation with someone who was looking to find an editor for a relatively small newsroom. And they said, you know who my perfect person for this would be? Is Dean Baquet. He's really great. And I just thought, are you freaking kidding me? Like, he's the editor of the New York Times.
Right.
You know, it's like if you're like, I want somebody to run this newsroom, and that's the like standard by which I'm going to judge. I'm like, you don't want a person of color. You want like LeBron James. You know, you want like a, you know, you want and so
for your pickup league.
For your pickup league. No, exactly. And so I just think that like I also think that that's like a big part of the problem is that like, all kinds of people get opportunities, and who gets those opportunities and who gets to pursue them is, you know, who's ready, who's not, you know, whose stories appear on the website and not in the magazine, you know, whose packages get picked up to lead the nightly news, all those kinds of things. I mean, those are the like real roadblocks. But I also think that we're in this cultural moment where, again, and I come back to this idea of like reputation management, where the primary fixation is trying to bat back the accusation that the news media is biased. And so when major news organizations right now are thinking about diversity, they're not thinking about you know, racial and ethnic diversity. They're not thinking about gender identity diversity. They're thinking about so-called political diversity, right? They want to make sure they've got a right-winger and someone, and usually a right-winger and a centrist, like not even a right-winger and somebody from the left, right? So in the rush to have, you know, this quote-unquote balance, I think you lost a lot of people of color from, certainly from the airwaves. I don't know that the same thing has happened in the print space. I think it's been less pronounced. And if anything, I think there's actually been a very welcome, you know, kind of run on talent, particularly people of color from places like the New Yorker, where you write. I mean, I think I saw in the issue that close to half of the new hires that they've made have been people who make the New Yorker more diverse, which I think is great. And so we experience that too, right? I mean, newsrooms like the New York Times, NBC, and elsewhere, they kind of strip mine our newsroom for diverse talent on a pretty regular basis. And I think it's great that there are lots of opportunities out there and that people want to diversify their newsrooms, but in an environment where smaller newsrooms are often stagnant and or actually shrinking, and the best talent from communities of color or other underrepresented communities are going to work at big news organizations, that's a great thing. But if those smaller news organizations are stagnating, then there's not that next crop coming up and coming in.
The kind of farm league system.
Like the City Paper was once.
Right, that's right.
Know? I mean, but I also think, I mean, it's also just, and now I'm just sort of riffing on the problem of diversity in general, but I mean, I think about how I got into journalism. I took an unpaid internship at the Washington Monthly, which, the Washington Monthly produced generations of really great journalists. And the only reason I was able to do that is I waited tables at night. And the reality is, at that time, this is in the late 90s, you could rent a studio apartment in Adams Morgan for $500 a month, right? So it was possible.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, but it was actually possible for me as a very young person to work 2 jobs and have an unpaid internship in a major metropolitan city. I think that's much harder to do now than it was then.
And we've had this conversation, and also I think there's another dynamic in this, which is that while we're talking about small institutions being really hollowed out by the changes to digital and lots of other things that are going on, that the tectonic shifts inside media, we almost don't talk about the traditional system that's nurtured talent of people of color, which has been the newspapers, like certainly African American publications.
Absolutely, yeah.
That most of my career, when I first started writing at the New Yorker, I would get these really curious emails where people would say, "Where have you been?" And I've been at Essence. I've been at Ebony. I've been writing for 20 years in a bunch of black publications that you never pick up.
Yeah.
And even other editors who you would think would be, when people ask the question of how do you diversify if you are poaching, if you're just going to kind of do the New York Yankees approach to steal everyone else's best players, at least the Steinbrenner era Yankees. I'm sorry, I'm dating myself here. But if you're going to do that approach to it, there are literally publications that are right there that have people of color that are working for them, but somehow or another there's never that kind of crossover.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that sort of is I think that just exposes some fundamental problems with journalism, right? If you are a journalist who's come up in the quote unquote race press, right? Somehow you haven't developed the same kind of quote unquote objectivity that one would expect in a reporter for the New York Times, or your range isn't wide enough. There's a whole bunch of euphemisms that people use to talk about people who work in the so-called race press. I mean, it was really interesting. We did this cross-country tour last year to visit small cities across the country. That was part of our effort to kind of try to figure out what are the issues we should really be focusing on, and we partnered with news organizations across the country, small news organizations in the most part. And our first stop on the trip was in St. Louis, and we partnered with the St. Louis American, which is one of the oldest African American newspapers in the country, and the role that news organization plays in the coverage of long before Ferguson, the coverage of, the issue of police brutality, housing inequality, all kinds of things, is just remarkable. And the reporters that they have on their staff are so talented. And I'm like, why are these people not getting picked up by other news organizations? And some of them, frankly, want to be working in that context and want to be, speaking directly to that audience. And I think that's a really interesting shift that's happened. And this may have been true in our, I don't know if you and I are roughly the same age, but may have been true in earlier generations.
I'm old.
You're old.
Just
okay.
Default old.
All right. I'm getting to old too. But there was a time when particularly black reporters did not want to get pigeonholed as covering, black communities or black issues. I mean, I have a good friend who, was asked to go and cover West Africa for the New York Times, and as a black person, he's like, well, what about China or Japan? Why always Africa? And but what's interesting is, and I see this on my staff, is that there is a real hunger among young African American writers to speak directly to the issues of our community and to an audience that is made up of our community, and much less of an interest in, I'm going to explain what's going on with black folk to white folk. And I think that in some ways the ecosystem that you came out of has been somewhat replicated in the digital world, whether it's The Root or Blavity or, and obviously a lot of these publications endure in digital ways and in print as well. But, it's a shadow of what it used to be.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this, in about 5 minutes, we're going to open for questions. I do want to ask, like, this one other thing about in the dynamics of being in the newsroom itself. Like, this is not particular to journalism, but lots of journalists do talk to me about this kind of weariness of having to be the person. If you are the person who's in the room, the weariness that comes with being the person in the room. I think Kyle mentioned this really great term that people were using for black checking. Oh, my mic.
Black checking.
Black checking. And so there's that job in addition to all the other responsibilities that come with that. And I just wonder, do you see the landscape of this changing? Do you see this getting better?
Well, I personally black check every article that runs on HuffPost. That's a joke. I don't.
Okay. But you do have a team of black checkers, like
we have a team of black checkers, just like at the New Yorker, but black.
It's like Soul Train line at the end of the day. We can just kind of run with this.
No, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think like it can take you down all kinds of like, rabbit holes. We had a really interesting internal debate about a piece that we did about Rihanna wearing dreads in Ocean's 8, and one reporter said, because we have these story critique sessions, and one reporter said this story was terrible because it didn't take account for the fact that as a Caribbean woman, Rihanna wearing dreads has a particular significant, meaning. And we had this like very lively roundtable discussion about it, where it was like, look, I'm a black person. I'm not of Caribbean descent. Does that mean that like I can't cover Rihanna's hair? Like, is that where we're at? Is that where we're at? Like, but I'd rather have that problem where like we're deciding like which kinds of black people can cover black things rather than like only having one black person to cover all black things.
Well, I mean, it's funny because we have the other side of it, which is a question that's come up really more times than I can count since I've been here at Columbia, which is that very often there are white students who feel like they can't write about issues that affect people of color. And one student just said this to me, and I said, imagine how a newsroom would work if someone was like, okay, there's been a police shooting of a young person, where's the black guy? Get over there. Oh no, wait, the person who was shot's white, come back. We're going to actually sit down with the ethnic board and assign people. Yeah. I think the issue is much more about making it such that people who are writing about things that have elements of race prominently or because beneath the surface, but are pertinent, that they do so with the same sort of nuance and care and the same sort of professionalism that you would bring if you were covering the economy.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that it's silly and reductive to say that only an African American can cover police brutality in America. Like it's just not true, right? I spent my entire career as a reporter in countries that I had no connection to whatsoever, where I had to try and inhabit and understand and educate myself and get the nuance, and places where I didn't speak the language. And that's a panel for another time on foreign correspondence on whether that's a good idea or not, but you can do it, and it just requires a lot of work. But I think that where newsrooms fall down is when they just have like the one or the two, right? If you have a newsroom that is really kind of studded with all kinds of different people at all kinds of different levels who feel empowered to guide and speak up and say, you might want to rethink the lead on that story, or there's a nuance. And again, Rihanna's hair, it's a big deal. Readers of HuffPost, they care a lot about Rihanna. Like I would have loved if somebody had said, hey, actually, like we should put in a line here about like the fact that that's super significant. I know that seems like a tiny thing, but like, your ideal newsroom is one in which there is a collective responsibility at all levels, and so that whoever picks up the story, whether it's a police shooting or the Florida governor's race, it's not just going to be the reporter out there on their own. It's going to be the reporter working with a group of colleagues who, amongst themselves, have a depth of knowledge and expertise. And I mean, the Florida governor's race is a really good example because, my colleague Julia Craven just went down there and did a really brilliant profile of Andrew Gillum, but she's also backed up by her colleague Shirish Date, who spent years covering Florida politics. She brought something very special as a Southern African American woman, hearing what Andrew Gillum was doing. Sharice brought something as a person who knows Florida politics soup to nuts. I have things to contribute. And in that sort of collective, you hope to get to something that really does approximate the truth and what's really happening.
So if you have a question, please come to the microphone. Let me just say this really succinctly. Please phrase your question. Let's give you a question within maybe 30 seconds or so. A question, in case there's any confusion, is generally a sentence with an inflection at the end, implying that it is a request for information. And so please frame it such as that. And if we can kind of do that succinctly, we can get through as many questions as we can before we have to break.
So I have a question. The New York Times has been criticized a lot for its diversity and its hiring in the last while. And having gone through the experience of being in the newsroom and rising to a senior masthead level, I'm really interested in the standards and practices that you saw are different when it comes to staffing at your current job versus your past job. Because Huffington Post has been recognized for really representing both verticals that are really diverse and allowing those editors and reporters to have opinions based on their reporting and expertise, versus the New York Times, which had a documentary that only featured predominantly white faces. And so I'd love to hear more about your standards and practices and how you consistently continue to make sure that you're hiring at various levels demographics that reflect the United States.
I mean, I'm not going to speak to the New York Times hiring practices. I think that the Times has made extraordinary strides in making its staff more diverse. I think that whether it's race and ethnicity, gender identity, I think there's been a very serious and concerted effort to transform that newsroom, and it's a work in progress. And we all live in glass houses, so I don't throw stones. We struggle with diversity just as much as the New York Times does. And I think that we have a history and a legacy at HuffPost of being really focused on serving communities of color, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our stats look better or worse than anybody else's. So, glass houses, no stones. I will say that, both at HuffPost, but also at Verizon, our parent company, they actually have pretty hardcore requirements when it comes to diversity and inclusion in hiring, in promoting, and all those kinds of things. We're required to have diverse candidates in every pool, and they have to be the finalists have to include a diverse someone who comes from a background that would make our newsroom more diverse. And we don't take the easy route. We are overrepresented by white women, for example. So a white woman does not count as a diverse candidate, whereas it might in an engineering department. People's salary and bonuses and things like that are tied to promoting to making their staff more diverse. But look, I run a newsroom that has not grown hugely. in order to diversify our staff, we are dependent on attrition. So, I can say with pride that, of the last 10 hires we've made, 50% of them make our newsroom more diverse, right? But if there is a debt, and I think this is true of the New York Times, it's true of any news organization in America, then it's going to take some time to get that transformation going. But we employ all of the kind of most aggressive practices that are recommended, and then some in our newsroom to try and make sure that we're getting the most diverse pool possible. But it's also like the best talent that we get comes from our staff, and our staff, because it is diverse, we just tend to get a more diverse applicant pool, which is great. So,
you raise an interesting point that I want to think about in terms of we typically say that the issue is the pipeline, but here at Columbia we are somewhere around 70% female in our student body. We typically hover around there, as are many other journalism schools, and the same thing that we're seeing with law schools. That especially undergrad institutions, heavily female population. But when we look at what our numbers look like in our program and what other programs look like, and then we look at the newsroom, there's a plummet. And then when we look at the leadership of those newsrooms, and the numbers fall again. And so I wonder if, how much of this is, the opposite side of it is often with people of color. They're saying, oh, there's not enough for us to make these hires. But I guess some of this is also dynamics that happen once people are in the system, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that, the reasons that women do not rise in newsrooms are, pretty well documented, and I think we have a pretty clear idea of the things that would make it easier. The New York Times has had one female executive editor, and unless there's some huge surprise, it seems unlikely the next one will be a woman, although who knows. So I think that's it's an issue of as people's careers progress, the top of the pyramid gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the people who drop out tend to be women. They tend to be people of color. And it's you can see the reasons that happens. In the case of women, maybe it's it's gender bias. There's women being punished for in their careers for having children. There's a whole host of things. And when it comes to people of color, I think there are a bunch of other not dissimilar issues that come up. You kind of hit up against the ceiling, and it's just going to take it's going to take time, and it's going to take concerted effort of putting people in positions where they can rise even before you think that they're ready, because often women are given opportunities because they're qualified, and I think the same thing is true of people of color, whereas white men tend to be given opportunity because they show promise. And I think that in my personal experience, both women and people of color get tired of waiting to be given opportunities that they see going to people who have less experience than them. Those people tend to be white men. And another interesting phenomenon, I think, is also that that in newsrooms, those top leadership positions in some ways have become less attractive over time, and a lot of really talented people actually want to be writers or on-air talent or things like that, as opposed to being an executive. Trust me, my job as a foreign correspondent was the most fun job you could ever have in the world. And being a media executive, it's fun in a different way, but I can see the appeal of continuing to be a foreign correspondent your entire life. But I also think this was a really striking thing. The New York Times has had a really tough time getting women, really talented female journalists, to become editors and kind of get on that management track. Yet at the same time, the New York Times, when I was there, the last year that I was there, the Jerusalem bureau chief, the Beirut bureau chief, Delhi bureau chief, the main person covering Syria and Afghanistan, they were all women with young kids. So it also, like, there's also something interesting going on between, like, being, to use the dreaded word, content, like being a content creator with like a byline and a face out in the world, being more appealing as a longer term career choice than joining the executive ranks and like climbing up that way, which I think is a really interesting. It's a really interesting phenomenon, because I think that, when you have a byline and you're creating journalism, your work is visible and people read it. And particularly now in the internet age, like, if you've got a great story, people are going to tweet it and they're going to share it. And it kind of doesn't matter, like, whether your editor thought it should be a cover story or on the front page. It can find an audience. And so I sort of wonder, and I'm sort of just rambling through this in real time, I hadn't really thought about this before, but like, I sort of wonder if both women and people of color are like, that whole management thing is like a bit of a scam, that like, I'm gonna have to compete against like people who went to like Harvard and Yale, the work's not gonna be visible, the like, the performance indicators aren't going to be as clear, and I got a pretty good thing going here. I've got my reporting. I've also got my MSNBC contract. Like, I'm just going to keep doing this, and therefore they don't end up becoming executives. I, unfortunately, am a sucker and became an executive.
Hi. You said, Lydia, that the media did not take Trump's racism seriously. But as a layperson, not a journalist, all I read was that the media didn't take Trump seriously practically until the night that he won. Is that different? Did they treat him differently on racial than on other issues in that regard?
No, I think that there was a kind of, I do think that once he won the nomination, it was very clear that people did take him seriously, even if they thought that he was unlikely to win. Even being the nominee of the Republican Party meant that you needed to contend with Trump as a serious phenomenon, and he was clearly going to have a huge impact on what the Republican Party was going to look like going forward. So, I think people did take him seriously generally. I think that there's something kind of unmentionable about racism, right? Like, it's just, it's so common, and yet it seems like this thing that when you accuse somebody of it, it's just so terrible. It's you can never recover from it. It's, so there's just this incredible kind of gun shyness about talking frankly about racism in this country. Look at Steve King, right? This is this Iowa congressman who's up for re-election. People talk, this is a guy who's like openly associating with, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant groups. He's going to Europe and like meeting with proto-Nazis, and, people are too polite to say like, wait a minute, this guy is like, this is like really, really terrible. And, we wrote a story, my colleague Chris Mathias wrote a story whose headline was, Steve King is a white nationalist and the GOP doesn't care. And the story, eventually I think the GOP did care, but much too late, and only when it seemed like he was at risk of losing. But it's funny, like that story was actually, so I don't know if you guys have heard of this organization called NewsGuard that rates news organizations and gives people checks, and so they accused they gave us a green check. Daily Caller also has a green check, so I guess we're in good company. But one of the things that they dinged us for was confusing that we didn't responsibly handle news and opinion, and they singled out that piece as one example of this, right? But the facts were plain. Steve King is a white nationalist. He pals around with white nationalists. He retweets them. He goes to events with them. And the other part of the headline, which is that the GOP didn't care, that was also true. So if like, quote unquote, mainstream journalistic gatekeepers feel queasy about us running that story and that headline, I think that just shows that we're working in an environment in which the bar for openly saying that someone is racist is just really, really, really high. And that seems crazy to me. It just seems crazy.
And just as one quick aside, too, I think the difference between those not being taken seriously is that there was an element of people thinking that Trump was a joke for a long time, persisted for a long time. But that's different than mischaracterizing something that you've actually seen. So I was at some of those rallies, and what I saw was not people talking about economic anxiety. You know, even with the really, really vile language that was being used about Hillary Clinton, it was almost like, when I was a child, I got a kick out of the fact that if I was directly quoting someone, I could cuss in front of my mother. She couldn't say anything because I am quoting this person. It's like the excuse to do the thing that you could not do under any other circumstances. So it is completely unacceptable to refer to women by the terminology that was being tossed around at those rallies, but it's Hillary Clinton. And so it became this other thing. And to look at that and say that was about the economy was much more about the comfort level of the journalists than it was about the phenomenon that they were actually witnessing. And that's a different situation.
And that comes back to like white fragility. It comes back, you know, I mean, and again, I come back to this idea of amnesia. We all want to pretend that we don't have this horrible gaping wound in our national character. We just don't, you know, and as a result of that, we'd rather pretend that this isn't happening. You know, we want to cover it up. We want to provide excuses. It's like enabling an alcoholic, you know, and you know, we're a country of raceaholics, and nobody wants to talk about it.
So we have time for 2 questions.
Sorry.
We have time
round,
for 2 questions.
speed round.
All right, so let's do this. Let's do this.
quick.
Hold on. If you can ask your question really succinctly, let's ask all 3 questions, and we'll try to deal with them like at once.
Okay.
Sure. So this is kind of a turn from the past few questions. Lydia, you were speaking about making a parallel between the last 18 months of Obama's tenure and then Congress in India. How do we, I'm a student of public and international affairs, how do we make a parallel between those moments or compare Bolsonaro's rise, Modi's rise, Trump's rise, without being relativistic and also patronizing to readers? So how do we talk about, you know, what's happening? And I think both of those publications kind of do it well, but at times, as someone who's increasingly writing about international affairs, I'm finding, you know, explaining contexts extremely difficult.
Yeah. All right, let's get all the 3 questions and then we'll answer them rapid fire.
Okay, my name is Dory. I'm with Neighborhood Defender Service as well as IAMI. And the question is that we have 3 practices, civil, family, and criminal. We see a lot of excuse me, I'm a little nervous now that there's all this pressure. We see a lot of coverage around like people entering without inspection and separations at the borders. We see a lot of coverage about like racial disproportionality and surveillance, arrest, conviction, jail time, but we don't see any coverage around the sort of domestic separation, increased racial disproportionality with surveillance, you know, children being removed, staying in foster care, leaving foster care without, you know, without being reunited with their family, and the sort of separation in the child welfare system and how that parallels what's happening both at the border and in the criminal world. My question is, why do you think that that's not a story, or why that hasn't been picked up as a story when these other 2 stories feel very parallel, but there's this gap here?
Okay.
Thanks. What has been the most effective incentive you've used or seen used to have mainstream gatekeepers deliberately move toward anti-racism?
That's a great question. I can start with the question about this kind of like international. I mean, it's funny. We all talk about the rise of nationalism and the right being a global story. That always feels very kind of like survey-ish, right? Like, this is what's happening in Brazil, and this is what's happening in this place. But I think, to me, like, all of these stories only make sense in the context of, extremely fast-moving globalization and technological change, and that's only by understanding like the ways in which our world is changing so fast, and the failure of elite institutions to manage that change in a humane way. To me, that's the connective tissue that brings them all together. So I think like if you're not addressing those issues, then you're doing it wrong. So.
And the second question, which was about the domestic separations that are not being discussed in the...
Yeah, I think this is like one of those stories where it's like, it's almost like a bandwidth question. And we often talk about like news is like what's new, and what's new right now is separations at the border, so that's getting all the focus and attention. But look, our systems of foster care, welfare, human services, all of those kinds of things, they're in crisis. We have had, a few decades now of, gutting of all of the various institutions, both under Republican and Democratic presidents, that are designed to take care of our most vulnerable population. So of course it's no surprise that this is where we find ourselves. But I think you're going to confront a media world in which we're all kind of like chasing what's the latest crisis, and the deeper, more systemic crises tend to fall by the wayside, and that's just kind of the reality of how news works.
And the final question was about the most effective strategy of getting news organizations to adopt anti-racist positions. Is that correct?
Jelani, I think you should answer that one.
Yeah, I don't know. If I knew the answer, I guarantee you I would be like standing on 125th Street in Lenox and shouting it into a bullhorn, or I'd be on 42nd Street in front of the New York Times shouting. But I think that the best thing that I can say is simply that there have been publications that recognized the kind of insidious nature. I don't think that it's completely bleak. There have been publications that recognize the insidious nature of racism in this country, and we remember those publications for that reason. There's the tradition that I talked about of the publications of people of color. There's a Native press, which we talk about in this issue as well. There's a Native press and a Latino press and an African American press that have been really concerned about the issues that affect these communities. And in addition, I think that when we go back and look at the way that news coverage changed the tenor of the civil rights movement, that was crucial. So I hold a position called the Ira A. Lipman Professorship. Ira Lipman was a 15-year-old high school student who, as one of the kind of defining points in his life, was a source for John Chancellor during the Little Rock crisis. And he is, to this day, someone who remains vitally interested in these issues of social justice and in the ways in which media can be effective. And I think that what I take from that is that if a 15-year-old can see his hero, John Chancellor, and say, I'm going to tell you what's happening, with Little Rock, and that actually does have some impact on public perception of what was happening there, that maybe you don't make an institution comprehensively anti-racist, but you do have moments in which the indignity and danger and corrupting capacity of racism is exposed, albeit through a mainstream institution. And I think that may be the best we can hope for at some points. So thank you all for coming out, and Kyle. And thank Lydia for this conversation.
Yes, thank you to both of them. It's a great privilege for CJR to be able to host these kind of conversations. Please join us for drinks, and thank you very much for coming.